The evening sun had long dipped behind the hills, and a mist rolled through the village of St. Mary Mead, painting the cobblestone streets in shades of grey. Inside the grand dining room of the Crayford estate, Lord Edmund Crayford's guests were finishing a lavish dinner, their laughter echoing through the large, tastefully decorated hall. The estate had seen its fair share of lively gatherings over the years, but tonight there was an air of unspoken tension among the guests, though no one could put a finger on exactly why. The evening had started like any other. Lord Crayford had invited his usual circle of wealthy friends for a night of fine food and wine, and at the heart of the evening, as always, was the impeccable service provided by his ever-loyal butler, Geoffrey. Geoffrey had worked for the Crayford family for over a decade, never once raising suspicion, always performing his duties with silent efficiency. But now, as the last remnants of dessert were cleared away, the atmosphere began to shift. Lord Crayford, his face reddening with frustration, stood at the head of the table. "Where on earth is Geoffrey?" he muttered, glancing around as if expecting the butler to materialize at any moment. The other guests exchanged uneasy looks, each one hoping that Lord Crayford's irritation was just a passing whim. But after several minutes of awkward silence, it became evident that Geoffrey was nowhere to be found. "Perhaps he's attending to something in the kitchen," suggested Mrs. Helen Baines, an elderly widow who was never one to shy away from inserting herself into any conversation. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. Lord Crayford's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "The kitchen," he repeated, but there was no amusement in his voice. "I would have seen him leave." The guests fell into an uneasy silence, their glasses of wine suddenly tasting far less pleasant. Still, they remained seated, as if not wanting to disrupt the fragile calm. It was at that moment that a sound, faint but unmistakable, emerged from the hallway beyond the dining-room door. It was a muffled thud, followed by a few faint scuffing noises. The guests turned toward the sound, the tension in the room palpable. Without a word, Lord Crayford stood up and hurried toward the door. He flung it open, revealing a narrow corridor that led to the back servants' quarters. At the far end of the hall, Geoffrey's body lay sprawled across the floor. A gasp escaped Mrs. Baines, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The guests rushed to Lord Crayford's side as he bent down over the motionless form of his butler. Geoffrey's face was pale, his body twisted at an odd angle, and there were no obvious signs of a struggle or injury. His uniform, typically impeccable, was askew, but it did little to hide the eerie calm of his features. It was as though he had simply collapsed where he stood. "Is he?" began one of the guests, a young woman whose name no one could quite recall, her voice trailing off as she stared at Geoffrey's lifeless form. Lord Crayford's hand hovered over the butler's pulse before he sighed, a deep, resigned sound. "He's dead," he murmured. "But how?" Mrs. Baines, ever the nosy observer, pushed her way to the front. "Could it have been some sort of accident?" she asked, though her eyes were wide with fear. The others seemed to consider her words, but the idea of an accident didn't fit. Not when there was no apparent cause. "Accident?" Lord Crayford's voice was sharp, his disbelief obvious. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Geoffrey would never simply fall like this." A few moments later, the village constable, Robert Hayes, arrived on the scene, his heavy boots clumping down the hallway as he entered the room. The guests were still in shock, unable to make sense of the situation. "I'll need to examine the body," Constable Hayes muttered, pulling on a pair of gloves. He knelt down next to Geoffrey and began his inspection. As he did, a peculiar detail caught his eye. A small, seemingly insignificant item tucked into the folds of the butler's jacket. It was a scrap of paper, wrinkled and stained with something that looked like ink. "Here, what's this?" Hayes asked, holding up the crumpled paper. The guests leaned forward in a collective, uneasy curiosity as the constable slowly unfolded. The paper contained a single line, hastily scrawled, "The last will is in the study under the chair." Everyone in the room went silent. A will? Was it a clue? A message left by the deceased? And why was it in Geoffrey's possession? Lord Crayford's face turned white as he reached for the paper. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. "There's no will." "None that I know of," the constable nodded grimly. "Seems like a lead, doesn't it?" It wasn't long before word spread to the rest of the village, and soon enough Miss Marple arrived on the scene. Her small, unassuming frame, with her grey hair pinned neatly under a bonnet, was a welcome sight in the midst of such confusion. She took in the details of the situation with practiced ease, her sharp eyes scanning the room, the body, the guests. She had seen much in her day, and there was no mistaking the look of an unsolved crime. Lord Crayford greeted her with a mixture of impatience and relief. "Miss Marple, you've come. I don't know how to make sense of it. Geoffrey is dead. And this note." Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully, her eyes twinkling as she inspected the scrap of paper in Lord Crayford's hand. "The last will is in the study under the chair. How curious. A butler with knowledge of a secret will, of all things." She paused for a moment, her sharp mind piecing together the possibilities. "I suggest we search the study thoroughly," she said, "but let's not be too hasty. Sometimes a seemingly random clue is the key to a much more intricate puzzle." And so, with Miss Marple leading the way, the investigation began, a case that seemed impossible to crack, yet one that held a mystery within a mystery. The affair of the missing butler had only just begun, and the real questions were only starting to emerge. What had Geoffrey known? What had he tried to reveal before his untimely death? And why had he died at all? Miss Marple moved quietly through the grand hallway, her soft footsteps barely audible against the thick carpet. The guests lingered nervously in the drawing-room, whispering amongst themselves in hushed tones, as Constable Hayes and a few of the other local constables busied themselves with routine tasks, collecting statements, searching the estate for any further clues. But Miss Marple, ever patient and ever observant, had already begun her own quiet investigation. The study was at the far end of the house, its heavy wooden door standing ajar as Lord Crayford gestured for Miss Marple to enter. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the situation had aged him years in a matter of hours. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice weary, "I must admit, I never expected anything like this. Geoffrey, I trusted him completely." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Yes, Lord Crayford, it's a most perplexing case." She stepped further into the study, her gaze flicking over the polished mahogany desk, the shelves of books neatly arranged, and the elegant, leather-bound chair that sat at the centre of the room. There was nothing overtly out of place, yet a subtle unease hung in the air, as though something was amiss just beneath the surface. Her first instinct was to look at the chair mentioned in the note. It was an antique piece, with deep grooves and a cushion worn from years of use. She moved toward it, running her hand along the armrest, noting its softness. It wasn't unusual for a butler to leave such a personal note behind. It could have been a clue or perhaps a desperate attempt to communicate something important. But for the moment, she would have to trust her instincts. "Lord Crayford," she said, turning toward him, "I must ask you, did Geoffrey seem different in any way these past few days? Anything unusual?" Lord Crayford hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "Not really. He was the same as ever, efficient, professional, but—" He trailed off as though searching for the right words. "He did seem a bit distracted the last time I saw him. He was acting odd." "Odd?" Miss Marple repeated, her curiosity piqued. "In what way?" "It was subtle, really," Lord Crayford said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to recall. He seemed preoccupied, distant, almost as if he were trying to hide something, but he never said a word about it. Miss Marple's mind began to churn, considering this new piece of information. Geoffrey had been acting strange, but why hadn't he confided in his employer? And what was he trying to hide? As she stood by the chair, her eyes caught something, just a flicker of movement, barely noticeable. A small object had been carelessly placed on the edge of the desk, almost as if it had been hastily forgotten. A silver pen. But it wasn't the pen itself that caught her attention. It was the subtle indentation on the desk, the faint outline of something that had been hastily moved. She leaned in closer, inspecting the desk more carefully. There, beneath the pen, a piece of paper, a letter, crumpled and half hidden, lay, partially buried in the mess of papers. It was a simple thing, ordinary at first glance, but it had clearly been pushed aside with some urgency. Miss Marple's fingers skimmed the edge of the paper, carefully lifting it out from beneath the pen. Her eyes scanned the few lines written in a hurried hand, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a hurry to finish. The letter was addressed to Lord Crayford. The message inside was brief, its contents immediately catching Miss Marple's sharp attention. "Lord Crayford, I fear I am no longer safe here. There are matters at play beyond my control, and I must warn you that I have learned things I was never meant to know. My position has become compromised, and I cannot continue to serve as I have. Please trust no one." The rest of the letter was incomplete, the words trailing off, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. "Lord Crayford," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but low. "This letter, it suggests that Geoffrey may have been in danger. Perhaps he uncovered something that put him at risk. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Lord Crayford's face went pale as he stepped closer, eyes scanning the letter with growing unease. I don't know. It doesn't look like Geoffrey's writing, but the contents—" He trailed off, his hand gripping the back of the chair for support. "This is absurd. What could he have discovered? He was nothing more than a servant." Miss Marple looked at the letter with a knowing expression. "Lord Crayford, I believe Geoffrey had more knowledge than you realize, and that knowledge might have led to his death." Before he could respond, a soft creak sounded from the doorway, followed by the distinct shuffle of someone entering the room. Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Baines standing hesitantly in the doorway, her usual air of confidence replaced by a look of anxiousness. I couldn't help overhearing," Mrs. Baines said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to say, I did notice something strange last night, something that may be of interest." "Please, Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "What did you observe?" "Well," Mrs. Baines began, wringing her hands, After dinner, Geoffrey was in the drawing room, but he seemed off. He was acting strangely, like he was nervous about something, and when I asked him if everything was all right, he didn't answer. He gave me a look, a very strange look, as if he were trying to tell me something, but he didn't speak. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. What sort of look? Fear, Mrs. Baines whispered, her voice trembling. Fear and something else, like he wanted to warn me but didn't know how. The room grew silent as the significance of her words settled over them. Geoffrey had been afraid, and whatever he had known had terrified him. The piece of the puzzle was slowly falling into place, but the full picture was still unclear. Lord Crayford, Miss Marple said, turning to him, I would like to speak with the staff, everyone who had contact with Geoffrey in the days leading up to his death. We need to understand more about his behaviour, the things he may have overheard, and the possible secrets he had uncovered. Lord Crayford hesitated, his face clouded with confusion and worry. You think one of the staff might be involved? I think it's possible that Geoffrey's death was not an accident, Miss Marple replied quietly, and that it was no coincidence that this clue, this letter, was hidden here, where it would be easily found. She looked at him steadily. Someone wanted this to be discovered. But who? As Miss Marple spoke, Constable Hayes re-entered the room, his face grim. We've finished our search of the grounds, he said, his eyes flicking nervously between the assembled group. There's nothing out of the ordinary except what? Miss Marple asked, her curiosity piqued. There's something strange in the library, Hayes said quietly. A book missing from its shelf, a book that seems to have been removed recently. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another clue? Or a deliberate attempt to conceal something? She turned to Lord Crayford. We must investigate the library next. If Geoffrey was hiding something, it might still be there. With a nod, Lord Crayford led the way, and the investigation continued, each step revealing more secrets. But still, the true mystery of Geoffrey's death remained just out of reach. Miss Marple sat back in the dimly lit library, her sharp eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. The shelves of leather-bound books towered around her, their spines unyielding and solid, like the walls of a fortress. Lord Crayford had led them here immediately after the discovery of the missing book, and the stillness of the room felt almost oppressive. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot. As they had entered, Miss Marple had immediately noticed the space where the missing book had once been. The shelf appeared orderly enough with most of the volumes standing at attention, but there was a distinct emptiness where a book should have been, an unnatural gap, one that suggested a hurried or deliberate removal. She had given it a quick inspection, but there were no immediate signs of disturbance. The book had been taken with care, its absence marked by the faintest disruption in the otherwise meticulous arrangement. Lord Crayford shifted uneasily by the door, his face a mask of barely contained anxiety. I don't understand, he muttered, his hands wringing together. Why would anyone take a book from the library? There's nothing special about it, nothing that should matter. Miss Marple considered this for a moment. I imagine that's exactly why it was chosen, Lord Crayford. If the book had been important or valuable, its disappearance would have been noticed immediately. But this is subtle. It's designed to go unnoticed. She turned to Constable Hayes, who had been standing quietly by the window scanning the garden beyond. Has anyone in the household mentioned a book that seemed out of place? She asked, her voice soft yet probing. Hayes glanced at her with a furrowed brow. Not that I can recall, Miss Marple, but I'll check again. We've questioned the staff, but nothing has come of it so far. Miss Marple nodded, but she was already formulating her next question. Perhaps we should speak with the individuals who were closest to Geoffrey in the days leading up to his death. The answers we seek might lie with them. Lord Crayford looked momentarily taken aback. You think someone in the household is involved? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I'm not sure yet, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. But it's always worth considering. They left the library, and the group made their way to the dining room where the remaining guests had gathered, now anxiously awaiting the next steps of the investigation. The first to be questioned was Mrs. Baines, whose earlier comment about Geoffrey's fearful look had piqued Miss Marple's interest. The elderly widow was seated on a chaise lounge, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but the tremor in her fingers was still visible. Mrs. Baines, Miss Marple began, her tone polite but direct. You mentioned that Geoffrey seemed nervous the evening before his death. Could you tell me more about that? Did he say anything? Was there a specific moment that struck you as odd? Mrs. Baines blinked, as if recalling the scene in her mind. It wasn't anything overt, she began, her voice soft. He just seemed anxious. There was a tension in his posture, something that wasn't usual for him. You see, he'd always been so polite, so professional, but that night he seemed distracted. He was almost avoiding me, you might say. I asked him if anything was wrong, and he just gave me a strange look, like he was trying to hide something. And this look, Miss Marple pressed, leaning forward slightly. What kind of look was it? Could you describe it? Mrs. Baines hesitated, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features. It was a fearful look, as if he knew something he didn't want to share. I think he was trying to tell me something, but he didn't know how. He just left quickly after that. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind whirring as she absorbed the information. Mrs. Baines's account seemed sincere, but the hesitation, the reluctance to go into detail made Miss Marple wonder if there was something more lurking beneath the surface. Did he say anything to anyone else before he left? Miss Marple asked. Did anyone else notice his behavior? Mrs. Baines shook her head, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the door, as if she were uncertain about what to say next. I don't know. I wasn't in the kitchen or the servants' quarters after that. I'm afraid I can't be of much help. Miss Marple gave her a kind, understanding smile, though her mind was already turning over the contradictions in the old woman's words. Mrs. Baines had been close enough to Geoffrey to notice his distress, but why had she been so vague when pressed for details? Was it fear? Or was there something she wasn't telling them? Next, Miss Marple turned her attention to a younger woman, Miss Annabelle Webb, a friend of Lord Crayford's daughter, who had been quiet throughout the questioning. Annabelle had been one of the last to leave the dinner party, and her quiet demeanour seemed at odds with the severity of the situation. Miss Webb, Miss Marple began, her voice calm but piercing. You were one of the last to speak with Geoffrey before. He disappeared, weren't you? Annabelle stiffened slightly, her hands clutching the arm of her chair. I suppose I was, she said, her voice faltering for a moment. But I didn't speak with him much. Just a quick exchange. A quick exchange? Miss Marple echoed, noting the subtle hesitation in the woman's voice. What exactly did you say to him? Annabelle fidgeted, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. I asked him if he needed help with anything, she said quickly. He didn't seem to want to talk, though. He just nodded and went on his way. And did he seem disturbed? Troubled? Miss Marple pressed, her gaze never leaving the younger woman's face. Annabelle hesitated longer this time, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. He seemed fine, she replied, though her voice was shaky. I didn't notice anything. Wrong. Miss Marple observed her for a moment, noting the inconsistency between her words and the nervous energy radiating from her. She seemed too eager to dismiss any concerns, too eager to avoid giving anything away. And yet, Miss Webb, Miss Marple continued, her voice still measured, it seems to me that you're quite eager to distance yourself from Geoffrey's troubles, almost as though you're hiding something. Annabelle's eyes widened, but she quickly recovered, offering a tight smile. That's not true. I simply don't know anything. I can't help you. Miss Marple gave her a small, knowing smile. Of course, Miss Webb, of course. As the questioning continued, it became clear to Miss Marple that the truth was slowly beginning to emerge, though it was still shrouded in mystery. Each person she spoke with, each witness, seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, but the contradictions between their stories were impossible to ignore. Mrs. Baines's fearful silence, Annabelle's nervousness, and the subtle tensions that lingered in the room painted a picture of deception, a picture in which every word, every glance seemed to carry hidden meaning. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the fragments together. The missing book, the fearful glances, the odd behavior, it all pointed to something far more complex than a simple death. But what? And who among the people in this house had the most to gain from Geoffrey's silence? The answer was still elusive, but Miss Marple knew that with each passing moment, the shadows of deceit were growing clearer. Soon, the truth would be impossible to hide. The evening air had turned chill by the time Miss Marple gathered the guests and staff in the drawing-room for the next round of questioning. The house, once full of lively chatter, now seemed stifling in its silence. Even the grand clock on the mantel, normally a reassuring companion to the passing hours, ticked louder in the room, its rhythmic sound almost too heavy for the atmosphere. But Miss Marple's mind was far from distracted by the solemn quiet. It was focused, sharp as ever, sifting through the ever-growing web of lies, motives, and misdirections that seemed to cling to everyone in the room. Her investigation had uncovered more than she had anticipated. The subtle inconsistencies in Mrs. Baines's testimony, the nervousness of Miss Webb, and the general reluctance of the other staff members to offer up anything beyond the basics, each of them had given her just enough to suggest that something far more sinister lay beneath the surface. Lord Crayford had kept his composure admirably, though Miss Marple noted the tightening of his jaw whenever certain topics were raised. He had already denied any knowledge of Geoffrey's troubles, but there was no denying the wealth of secrets hidden in his past. Geoffrey, as she had learned, had been close to the family for years. But had the man been hiding his own skeletons? Or had he stumbled upon the Crayford family's darker dealings? Her first real step into unraveling the case was to piece together the connections, and the first part of that puzzle began with Geoffrey himself. The butler, she now realized, had been more than just a loyal servant. He had been a quiet observer of the lives of those around him, privy to conversations, secrets, and perhaps even betrayals. Miss Marple began with the simplest connections, the ones that were easiest to see. Lord Crayford's recent financial difficulties were well known. A once thriving estate, now struggling to maintain its grandeur, with creditors knocking at the door. His daughter, Eleanor, had been vocal about the family's need to secure a marriage for her that would restore their fortune. The mention of Geoffrey acting oddly, distracted, nervous, began to make sense. Had he uncovered something that tied the Crayford family to shady dealings or debts they had been hiding? Was his death a way to silence him before he could expose a secret? Then there was Mrs. Baines. She had been one of the first to mention Geoffrey's unusual behaviour, but it seemed she was more than just an innocent witness. She was the widow of a former business associate of Lord Crayford, and some whispers around the estate suggested that their partnership had been more than strictly professional. Had Mrs. Baines once been in love with Lord Crayford, or was it more about money, about the business dealings that had ultimately failed? Miss Marple could not ignore the possibility that Mrs. Baines had something to gain from Geoffrey's death, especially if he knew anything about the long-buried secrets between her late husband and Lord Crayford. Miss Webb, too, was a puzzle. At first glance, she had seemed like nothing more than a nervous young woman who had seen too much, but there was something about her eagerness to avoid the topic of Geoffrey's distress that set Miss Marple on edge. Annabelle Webb's family was well off, but her connection to the Crayfords was through Eleanor, and there had been rumours of a romantic interest between the two. If Geoffrey had learned something about a potential scandal involving the young woman, something that could destroy her reputation, might she have been willing to do anything to protect her future? As the night wore on, Miss Marple continued her inquiries, quietly noting each suspicious detail as it presented itself. Her suspicions swirled around one central question. What did Geoffrey know? What had he learned that would cause him to disappear and ultimately end up dead? The alibis were troublingly inconsistent. Mrs. Baines had been at dinner the entire time, but could she have slipped away unnoticed? Miss Webb had been in the drawing room, but no one could confirm she hadn't left at any point. The servants were, as expected, tight-lipped and reluctant to share anything of substance, but the tension in their eyes suggested they were all hiding something. The most curious piece of the puzzle, though, was the missing book. It had been removed from the library with care, its absence suggesting that whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for. Geoffrey, she now suspected, might have been the one to remove the book, but what was so important about it? And why had he gone to such lengths to hide it? Miss Marple had asked the staff, but none seemed to know anything about it. However, the matter would not be forgotten. She knew that whatever was in that book might provide the final clue to unraveling the truth. She returned to the drawing room, her steps measured but deliberate. The guests and staff sat anxiously, some looking down at their hands, others avoiding eye contact. Miss Marple studied them all with quiet precision, weighing their responses and their actions. They had all been present at one point or another when the crime occurred, yet none could offer a solid explanation for Geoffrey's sudden disappearance. "Lord Crayford," she said, turning to the man at the head of the room. His eyes met, hers with an unreadable expression, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if he might crack under the pressure. "You said Geoffrey had no reason to leave, that he was loyal to you. But I wonder, Lord Crayford, did you ever consider that someone close to you might want him gone?" His eyes flickered, a hint of something fleeting across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or the mere recognition of truth. He cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple." "Everyone has a reason to act," Miss Marple replied softly. "For Geoffrey, perhaps the reason was loyalty, but for others, Perhaps it was something more, something darker. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Jealousy, fear, or perhaps something else entirely. Lord Crayford's gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flash of something, an emotion, flicker behind his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She let the question linger, her sharp eyes scanning the room. One by one, she turned to the others. Mrs. Baines, whose bitterness seemed more deeply ingrained than her sadness allowed her to express. Miss Webb, whose carefully constructed demeanor hid a restless fear. And the rest of the staff, each one shifting uneasily under the weight of her gaze. The room was thick with tension now. The faces before her all seemed to hold secrets, but none were ready to reveal them. "The truth is often buried beneath layers of pretense," Miss Marple said quietly. "And for those of you involved, that truth is far from simple. You each have motives, whether you realize it or not. But I believe one of you holds the key, and soon enough, that key will open the door to the truth." As the words left her mouth, she saw it. A flicker of recognition, a slight shift in one of the guests' posture. Someone knew more than they were letting on. Someone had seen something, or worse, had been involved in something much darker than a simple death. The maze of motives was complicated, but Miss Marple was getting closer. Soon, the web would unravel. The next morning brought with it a sense of urgency that had settled into the household like a thick fog. The staff moved more swiftly through the halls, their faces tight with tension, as though they too felt the weight of Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. The grand clock in the hallway ticked louder than ever, marking the passing of time with a steadily growing rhythm, though no one could quite tell how much longer they would be trapped in this uncomfortable limbo. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting pale light across the stone floors, Miss Marple found herself once again seated in the drawing-room, the remnants of the previous evening's tension still hanging in the air. Lord Crayford had summoned the local constable to announce that a breakthrough had been made. It had come swiftly, almost too swiftly. The missing book had been found, nestled in the back of a rarely used cupboard in the library, its leather binding slightly worn and marked with a faint trace of dust. It seemed almost too perfect. The book was a ledger, an accounting journal, to be precise, containing entries that suggested a pattern of financial mismanagement, embezzlement, and cover-ups. It was precisely the kind of information that could ruin a family. Geoffrey, it seemed, had discovered the ledger hidden away in the manor, and had begun to piece together what it meant. Was this the secret he had been keeping? Had his discovery been the reason for his sudden disappearance, and perhaps ultimately his death? Miss Marple was not so quick to reach conclusions. She had seen this too many times before, the allure of a simple answer, a straightforward explanation that allowed those involved to breathe easy. But her instincts told her that this was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. It was too convenient, too neatly wrapped up, as if someone had orchestrated it deliberately to lead the investigation in one direction, a direction that would conveniently absolve others of their guilt. As the authorities began to close in on the discovery of the ledger, Miss Marple took a step back. She was not one to rush into conclusions. She had seen far too many cases where the apparent solution was nothing more than a well-crafted diversion. Lord Crayford's relief was palpable, his posture relaxing slightly as the weight of his own suspected guilt seemed to lift. He was quick to claim that the matter had been resolved. that the discovery of the ledger had revealed Geoffrey's motivations and the tragic consequences of his curiosity. But Miss Marple did not share his satisfaction. Her mind was churning, turning over the evidence, asking the questions no one else seemed willing to entertain. "Lord Crayford," Miss Marple said calmly, interrupting the flow of conversation that had begun to swirl around the apparent solution to the case. "I do believe we've found an important piece of the puzzle, but I'm afraid I still have reservations." The room went still, all eyes turning toward her, the hopeful expressions now tinged with a touch of confusion. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Lord Crayford asked, his voice tight, as though he were already prepared to move on from the investigation. "I mean, the discovery of the ledger is certainly a significant development," Miss Marple replied, her tone measured but resolute. "But it doesn't explain everything, does it?" Lord Crayford blinked, his brow furrowing, as he shifted in his seat. "What else could there be?" he asked. "We've found the book, and it implicates Geoffrey. It explains his actions, and surely that's enough." "I'm afraid it's not enough," Miss Marple said softly, though there was a firmness to her words that could not be ignored. "The ledger may point to financial mismanagement, but it doesn't explain why Geoffrey was killed, or who would have had the most to gain from his silence." Lord Crayford's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of frustration creeping into his expression. "Are you suggesting we're overlooking something?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, pausing to let her words settle, "that we've been given too easy an answer. Someone planted this discovery, and I don't believe it was Geoffrey. No, Lord Crayford, I believe this ledger was left here to lead us down the wrong path." The room fell into a heavy silence. For a moment it seemed as though Miss Marple had spoken too boldly, too confidently, but in her heart she knew she was right. Something about the timing, the simplicity of it, was too deliberate to be a mere coincidence. "Well then, what do you propose we do next?" Lord Crayford asked, his voice laced with both irritation and reluctant curiosity. "I suggest we take a step back," Miss Marple said quietly. "We need to look more closely at Geoffrey's relationships with those around him. If we're truly to understand why he was killed, we need to understand what each of you stands to lose." She turned her gaze to the others gathered in the room, her eyes lingering for just a moment longer on each face. It was subtle, but there was a distinct shift in the air, an unsettling realization that Miss Marple's suspicions had only deepened, not lessened. Mrs. Baines, who had been quiet until now, cleared her throat, her eyes darting nervously between Miss Marple and Lord Crayford. "Miss Marple, She paused, as though unsure how to proceed. "You must understand, Geoffrey wasn't like the other servants. He had aspirations, ambitions beyond his station. This piqued Miss Marple's interest." "Ambitions, you say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What sort of ambitions?" "I don't know for sure," Mrs. Baines replied, her voice strained, "but I know Geoffrey spoke about wanting a life beyond this house. He spoke of leaving, of starting anew, perhaps with someone from outside. Maybe he had a future in mind, but when he started digging into matters here, I think he started to threaten people." "And do you think that's why he was killed?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Mrs. Baines shifted uneasily, her hands wringing in her lap. "I don't know. But I know someone was upset with him, someone who didn't want the truth to come out." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already working. Mrs. Baines's words seemed significant. Yet she could not help but feel that this was another layer of misdirection. The pieces were there, yes, but they didn't fit together in any way. That made sense yet. As the day wore on, Miss Marple's thoughts only grew more focused. The false victory, the discovery of the ledger, had made the authorities rush to a conclusion too quickly, and it had allowed the real culprit to remain in the shadows, unnoticed and undisturbed. The threads of deception were still tangled, the connections still hidden beneath the surface. Miss Marple knew the investigation was far from over. In fact, she suspected they were only just beginning to see the first signs of the truth. The key to this mystery was not the ledger. It was the people in this house, each one hiding their own motives, their own dark secrets. And before the day ended, Miss Marple was determined to find out who among them had used Geoffrey's curiosity to their advantage. The afternoon sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow across the estate. The long shadows stretching across the grounds seemed to mirror the unsettling sense that Miss Marple's investigation was about to enter a far darker and more complicated phase. The ledger, while a tantalizing clue, had led the authorities down a well-worn path, one that Miss Marple knew would only bring them in circles. She had spent the better part of the day poring over every detail, carefully examining each scrap of information, but it was the past that kept pulling at her thoughts, the whispered secrets, the old alliances, the things that had been buried and forgotten over time. Her sharp gaze lingered over the faces of the suspects, each one now walking the fine line between guilt and innocence. The discovery of the ledger had been a false victory, a brief moment of triumph that the authorities had clung to with desperation. But Miss Marple knew there was more, something deeper, and it wasn't in the present at all. It was in the shadows of the past. As evening descended, Miss Marple's mind flitted back to a seemingly insignificant remark made earlier by Mrs. Baines. Something about Geoffrey's ambitions, his desire to escape the confines of the manor, to start a new life. It had been a fleeting comment, one that had almost been lost amid the tumult of the investigation. But now, in the quiet of her thoughts, Miss Marple could see the threads beginning to come together. Geoffrey had been a man who sought more than the life of a butler. He had spent his years observing the family, gaining knowledge, learning their weaknesses. Miss Marple was beginning to think that Geoffrey's ambition wasn't just about climbing the social ladder. It was about something far more dangerous. Geoffrey had unearthed a secret, something buried so deep in the family's history that it could destroy them. And that secret, Miss Marple realized, had not been on the ledger. It was in the past, hidden away in the deepest recesses of the Crayford family's affairs. Geoffrey had found it, perhaps by chance, perhaps on purpose. But once he did, he had made the mistake of sharing what he knew with the wrong person. She stood in front of the grand fireplace, gazing at the portrait of the Crayford ancestors, their stern faces peering down at her from their gilded frames. Their proud lineage had built this estate, and yet Miss Marple could sense the weight of their silence now. They were long gone, but their deeds, good and bad, remained etched in the very walls of the house. The question wasn't about Geoffrey's ambitions. It was about what those ambitions had uncovered. "Miss Marple?" Her voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find the housekeeper, Mrs. Peters, standing in the doorway. There was something tentative about her manner, as if she was unsure whether to intrude on the detective's moment of contemplation. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," Mrs. Peters said, her voice low. "There's something you might want to see." Marple's eyes narrowed in curiosity. "What is it, Mrs. Peters?" The housekeeper hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, a letter held delicately in her hand. "It was found among some old papers in the study. It's a letter, an old one from several years ago." Miss Marple took the letter, her fingers brushing against the fragile paper. It was yellowed with age, the ink faint but legible. She unfolded it carefully, scanning the words as they took shape before her eyes. The letter was dated 5 years ago, and it was addressed to none other than Lord Crayford. But it wasn't a letter of business or family matters. It was personal. A letter from a woman named Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn Marsh, Miss Marple muttered under her breath. She had heard the name before. Evelyn Marsh had been a name associated with a long-forgotten scandal, one that had been buried by the Crayford family years ago. It was a name that few people spoke of now, but those who knew it well. Evelyn had once been Lord Crayford's lover, a woman of considerable beauty and charm, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The scandal had nearly ruined the Crayford family's reputation. And here, in this old letter, was evidence that Lord Crayford had once been deeply involved with her. And more than that, the letter hinted at an even darker connection between the two. As Miss Marple read, her mind raced. Evelyn had written with an urgency that betrayed fear, her words full of accusations that Lord Crayford had betrayed her, that he had promised her a life together, only to abandon her once she became pregnant. The letter hinted at a child whose existence had been carefully erased from the records, a child whose very name had been buried beneath the weight of the family's pride. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. The connection was clear now. Geoffrey had known about Evelyn Marsh's child. He had discovered the existence of a son who had been hidden away in the family's past, his very existence erased from the official records. The Crayfords had gone to great lengths to keep this secret, but Geoffrey's curiosity and his ambition had uncovered the truth. The child had been the key all along. Geoffrey had realized that the Crayfords' perfect facade was built on a lie, and he had intended to expose it. He had come across the evidence, and he had been prepared to confront Lord Crayford with the truth, but someone had stopped him. And now, with the discovery of the ledger and the apparent resolution of the case, it seemed as though the secret would remain hidden. The authorities had been too quick to celebrate their progress, too eager to tie up the case neatly. But Miss Marple knew the real solution had always been closer than they realized. It wasn't just about money or financial mismanagement. It was about a child, a past that no one had wanted to confront. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, a quiet resolve settling over her. She turned to Mrs. Peters, who was watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Thank you," Miss Marple said softly. "You've given me a crucial piece of the puzzle." Mrs. Peters gave a small nod, but her gaze lingered on Miss Marple, as if she too understood that something far more sinister was lurking beneath the surface. The shadows of the past, once thought to be forgotten, were rising again, and with them the truth of Geoffrey's death. Miss Marple knew that the answers lay not in the ledger or in the present circumstances, but in the secrets that had been hidden long ago. And as the evening stretched into night, she knew it was time to confront Lord Crayford once more. The ghosts of the past would no longer remain silent. The estate was eerily quiet as dusk settled into a deep violet evening, the sky tinged with the final remnants of sunlight before the shadows of night took hold. Miss Marple stood before the grand window in the library, her eyes not on the tranquil view of the grounds, but on the carefully crafted lies that had been so meticulously woven by the people around her. The truth, she knew, was not buried in any ledger or letter. It was hidden in the actions, the reactions, the words left unsaid. Lord Crayford, Mrs. Baines, and the rest of the household had retreated to their respective rooms after the evening's revelation. Yet Miss Marple had not been content to let them slip away, not when the puzzle was so near completion, but still felt so far from solving. She had one last tactic up her sleeve, an unconventional approach that, though subtle, often uncovered the very cracks in a person's carefully curated facade. With the letter from Evelyn Marsh clutched tightly in her hand, Miss Marple moved silently through the halls, her footsteps soft on the polished wood floors. The other members of the household were scattered across the manor, most likely retreating into their own worlds of suspicion or fear. None of them knew that Miss Marple was about to turn their world upside down, employing a psychological strategy that often yielded unexpected results. Her first target would be Mrs. Baines. The housekeeper had been far too eager to provide information during the earlier interrogations, her willingness to cooperate bordering on desperation. And Miss Marple could sense something more, a fear beneath the surface, a fear that could be used to her advantage. Miss Marple found her in the small sitting room at the back of the house, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Mrs. Baines looked up in surprise when Miss Marple entered, but she quickly masked her emotions with a strained smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "I wasn't expecting you so late." "I know," Miss Marple replied, her tone casual, "but there's something I still don't understand. Something about Geoffrey's discovery of the ledger, his motivations." Mrs. Baines stiffened at the mention of Geoffrey. She shifted in her chair, her eyes flickering to the door, as though seeking an escape. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quickness of her glance. Mrs. Baines was hiding something, that much was clear. But Miss Marple would not press her immediately. Instead, she allowed a long silence to stretch between them, her quiet gaze never leaving the housekeeper. Finally, Mrs. Baines broke the silence, her voice softer this time. "I told you what I knew, Miss Marple. Geoffrey was always curious, always looking for ways to get ahead, to climb higher than his station. It's no surprise he dug into the family's affairs. And yet, despite his curiosity, he seemed afraid," Miss Marple said, her voice almost a whisper. "Afraid of what he might find, would you agree with that?" Mrs. Baines paled slightly, the cup of tea in her hand now trembling slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I mean, Geoffrey knew something that made him afraid. He discovered the truth about the Crayfords, didn't he? The child, the woman, he found it all, and that was enough to cost him his life." Mrs. Baines's breath caught, and her lips parted in what might have been an attempt to speak, but she held herself back. Miss Marple's words had struck a nerve, but not the nerve she had expected. Rather than confirming or denying the suspicion, Mrs. Baines recoiled, shifting in her seat, eyes darting to the window as though contemplating a sudden flight. It was in that moment that Miss Marple shifted her strategy. She wasn't just looking for answers. She was probing for reactions, testing the limits of the housekeeper's control. "I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice growing warmer. "It must be very difficult for you, Mrs. Baines, to be caught between loyalty to your employers and the need to protect yourself. It's a dreadful thing to have knowledge that could destroy someone's life, to carry it for so long. Mrs. Baines's eyes flickered, first toward the window, then toward Miss Marple, and in that brief hesitation, Miss Marple saw it, a crack in the facade. Mrs. Baines was not just scared of Geoffrey's discovery, she was terrified of something more. Her loyalty was not to the Crayfords, it was to something far more dangerous. The moment Miss Marple had been waiting for had arrived. She needed to capitalize on the housekeeper's vulnerability. "You needn't worry, Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple continued gently, her voice now laced with a note of understanding. "If you've been hiding something, I promise you that I'm not here to harm you. I merely want to know the truth, as I believe you do as well. All of us want justice, don't we?" The housekeeper's face was a mask of confusion and fear, but Miss Marple pressed on, her eyes soft and yet commanding. "I have no doubt Geoffrey's death was no accident, but someone here is trying to bury the truth. You've been close to it for some time, haven't you? Perhaps you can help me see it more clearly." A long pause followed, and for a moment it seemed as though Mrs. Baines might crumble under the pressure. She bit her lip, clearly weighing her options. Then, to Miss Marple's surprise, the housekeeper spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I never wanted to be part of this," she whispered. "But Geoffrey, he wasn't supposed to find out. He was too curious, too clever for his own good." "And yet you didn't warn him?" Miss Marple pressed. "You didn't stop him?" "I couldn't," Mrs. Baines said, her voice shaking. "He wasn't the only one looking for answers. He was just the only one who got too close. She stopped herself, her eyes darting toward the door again. "I shouldn't have said that." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "Mrs. Baines, who else knew? Who else was involved?" But before Mrs. Baines could respond, a sharp sound from the hallway interrupted them, a sudden knock at the door. The moment was broken, and in that instant Miss Marple knew that the housekeeper had said more than she had intended. The confession had been cracked wide open, but it was not yet complete. As Miss Marple turned toward the door, she knew that the final piece was coming closer. Whoever had been lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings of deception, would soon be exposed. But for now, she had to let the subtle cracks she had exposed lead her toward the next piece of the puzzle. "Thank you, Mrs. Baines," she said with quiet resolve, before the door opened, and the next act of the mystery began to unfold before her eyes. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken promise hanging between Miss Marple and the people she had yet to fully unravel. Mrs. Baines's confession had been a crack in the wall, but it was still incomplete. There was more to be said, and Miss Marple knew she would need to draw it out carefully. The door opened, and in walked the estate's lawyer, a man named Mr. Ainsley, his face as neutral as ever. He looked at Miss Marple, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice devoid of any real warmth, "I trust you're not troubling Mrs. Baines further. She's been through quite a lot." "Not at all, Mr. Ainsley." Miss Marple replied with a calm smile. "I was simply trying to piece together the last of the puzzle." Mr. Ainsley gave her a curt nod, but did not speak again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took his place by the door. There was something about his manner that set Miss Marple's instincts on edge. She watched him for a moment before turning back to Mrs. Baines, who now appeared even more nervous than before, her hands clutching the edge of her chair. "I believe I have enough for now, Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple said softly, sensing the housekeeper's unease. "Thank you for your honesty. If you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to let me know." Mrs. Baines nodded quickly, relief washing over her as she stood and hurried from the room. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her for a moment, before shifting back to Mr. Ainsley, whose steely eyes never left her. "I'll be in the library, Miss Marple," he said, his tone even and cool. "The police would like to hear your thoughts on the case as well." Miss Marple gave a small, nonchalant nod. "Of course, I'll be right there." As Mr. Ainsley left, the quiet returned, though it was an unsettling silence now, thick with the weight of the secrets still untold. Miss Marple walked to the window and gazed out at the estate, her mind turning over what she had learned. Geoffrey had found something that had cost him his life, and someone was desperate to stop her from finding the rest of the truth. It was then that the sound of footsteps in the hall caught her attention, faint but deliberate. She turned just in time to see Mrs. Baines re-entering the room, her face pale, her expression full of frantic energy. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, "you need to come quickly. Something's gone wrong." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She followed Mrs. Baines without a word, the housekeeper's trembling hands leading the way. They moved swiftly through the hallways, down the stairs and toward the study. The door was ajar, and the sight that greeted Miss Marple made her heart sink. The study was in chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open and emptied in haste. But what was most troubling was the desk, where the ledger, the key to the Crayford family's secrets, had been. It was now gone. The evidence, the one thing that had tied everything together, had vanished without a trace. "Where is it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice cold, her mind racing. "Who has taken it?" Mrs. Baines shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I left it here just an hour ago. I swear it was in this drawer. It was the only thing that could prove everything." Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of forced entry. The window was closed, and the door had been locked from the inside. Whoever had stolen the ledger knew the house well, and they had been careful. This was no random act of theft. It was deliberate, calculated, and designed to stop Miss Marple from uncovering the truth. As she moved to the desk and inspected the papers scattered about, she noticed something odd. A small piece of paper, half hidden beneath a stack of letters, caught her attention. It was a receipt, smudged and faded, but legible enough. She squinted, reading the name of a local pawnshop, and the date listed on the receipt, just 2 days ago. A shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. The ledger wasn't just gone. It had been sold, likely to someone who thought it would disappear forever. Whoever had orchestrated this knew the stakes were rising, and they were willing to do anything to bury the evidence. "Who knew about the ledger, Mrs. Baines?" Miss Marple asked, her voice sharp. The housekeeper looked stricken. "Only a few people, Lord Crayford, of course, and Mr. Ainsley. He was the one who insisted on keeping it in the study. He said it was the safest place." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the earlier encounter with Mr. Ainsley, his cold, unreadable expression. There had been something off about him from the moment they'd met, something that had never quite fit into the puzzle. She felt her suspicions tighten around him like a noose. "Thank you, Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "You may return to your duties now." The housekeeper nodded quickly and left, leaving Miss Marple alone in the study with her thoughts. She carefully folded the pawnshop receipt and tucked it into her pocket, her mind already running through the possibilities. The ledger had been stolen, but it had not disappeared completely. It had been sold, and whoever had bought it knew its value far better than any pawnshop clerk. The pieces of the case were falling into place faster than Miss Marple had anticipated, but with every answer came a new question, each one more urgent than the last. Someone was actively working against her, trying to keep the truth hidden, but Miss Marple had no intention of letting that happen. She had come too far, and the game was far from over. She stood silently for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The ledger had been taken, but the threads of deception were still tangled around the people she had come to know so well. She would not be deterred. The real criminal was still here, and Miss Marple knew that as long as she kept her wits about her, the truth would eventually emerge. As she left the study, the shadows of the manor seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. But Miss Marple walked with purpose. She had seen too much to stop now, and whoever was behind the vanishing evidence would not escape her grasp. The night had deepened, and the manor seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple moved through the halls, the faint click of her shoes the only sound breaking the silence. Her mind was consumed with the pawnshop receipt and the implications of the stolen ledger. Someone had tried to bury the truth, but they had only succeeded in making her more determined. Whoever was behind this knew they were losing control, and Miss Marple intended to keep it that way. She had been planning her next steps carefully, considering her conversation with Mrs. Baines and the details of the ledger's disappearance. But the house was heavy with tension, and despite the quiet, Miss Marple could sense that something was wrong. Something had shifted. It was as she passed the hallway outside the kitchen that she heard it, a muffled sound, a thud, followed by a quiet cry. Her heart jolted in her chest, and without hesitation she followed the noise. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, the light inside casting long shadows across the floor. Miss Marple stepped inside cautiously, her eyes immediately scanning the room. It didn't take long to find the source of the sound. Lord Crayford lay on the floor, his face twisted in pain, a dark red stain spreading across his shirt. The knife, its hilt gleaming in the dim light, had been driven deep into his side. His eyes were wide with shock, his hand desperately clutching at the wound. But it was clear from the way he lay there that he was beyond help. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that the stakes had just been raised. Lord Crayford's death was not just a tragic event, it was a direct message. Whoever had killed Geoffrey, and whoever had orchestrated the theft of the ledger, was now tightening the noose. Miss Marple had been so close to uncovering the truth, and yet it felt as though she had been blindsided by a new level of danger. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The murder was fresh, the blood still wet, and the circumstances surrounding it were too precise to be anything but deliberate. Lord Crayford had been the head of the household, and though he had seemed increasingly isolated and distant, he had never once appeared to be in danger. This had to be more than just a random act of violence. And yet, as Miss Marple looked around the kitchen, she saw something that made her pause, something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. The window was wide open, the breeze swirling, the curtains. Someone had been in here. Someone who knew how to slip in and out without making a sound. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the stillness. The police had arrived, their voices growing louder as they made their way down the hall. Miss Marple stood up, but before she could leave, a figure emerged from the shadows, Mrs. Baines, her face pale and her eyes wide with horror. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Baines whispered. her voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could stop it. I thought I could warn him." "Stop what?" Miss Marple asked, her voice sharp with urgency. She was already piecing things together, but there was more to this than Mrs. Baines could possibly know. I don't know," Mrs. Baines stammered. "I overheard a conversation earlier, just before I went to bed. It was Mr. Ainsley. He was talking to someone on the phone and I didn't catch all of it, but I heard him mention something about Lord Crayford being the next target. That's when I ran to check on him, but it was too late." Miss Marple's mind was already whirling, processing the information with incredible speed. Mr. Ainsley, the lawyer, had been too calm during the investigation, too smooth in his responses. And now, it seemed, his role in this tangled web was becoming clearer. He had been playing both sides, cooperating with the authorities, while secretly orchestrating the murders from behind the scenes. But it wasn't just Mr. Ainsley who was involved. No, there were others in this game, people who had waited patiently for their turn to strike. And Lord Crayford had been the first to fall, the pawn in a much larger game. "Get help, Mrs. Baines," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll stay here, but we can't let this slip any further. The killer is still here, and they'll strike again if we don't act fast." As Mrs. Baines fled the room to fetch the authorities, Miss Marple turned back to Lord Crayford's body. She could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on her, and yet there was something else, something deeper, that gnawed at the back of her mind. Whoever had killed Lord Crayford had done so with careful calculation. They had waited for the right moment, ensuring that the body would be discovered by the one person who would bring the case into sharper focus, Miss Marple herself. The murderer had known she was close, and now they had decided to throw the investigation into complete disarray. Miss Marple straightened up, looking down at the body one last time. The mystery had taken a sharp turn, and she was no longer just solving a murder. She was preventing the next one from happening. Whoever had been pulling the strings was now trying to erase the consequences of their actions, and Miss Marple would not allow that. She glanced toward the door, the noise of the approaching police growing louder. They would try to control the scene, to take charge of the investigation. But Miss Marple knew something they didn't. The villain, whoever they were, was still several steps ahead, and the detective would have to be even quicker to stop them from claiming another victim. The officers entered. Miss Marple stepped aside, her gaze sharp as she scanned the room. The game had changed, and she was ready. The killer might have thought they could outsmart her, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Miss Marple was no longer chasing the truth. Now she was racing against time to save the next life from being snuffed out. The police swarmed the kitchen, taking charge of the scene with practiced efficiency, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the sense of urgency that clung to her. Lord Crayford's death was a significant blow, but it wasn't just the murder itself that weighed heavily on her. It was the feeling that something bigger was at play, something she was still only starting to understand. She watched the officers as they moved about, documenting the scene, speaking in hushed tones, their faces set with the seriousness of their work. But Miss Marple was not ready to be swept away by the immediacy of the crime. She had learned long ago that the truth often hid in the details, in the things others overlooked. And so, as the police continued their work, Miss Marple allowed herself to step back, allowing her mind to sift through the growing chaos, searching for that one thing, that elusive thread that would unravel the entire case. The puzzle pieces were scattered before her, a tangled web of motives, lies, and deceit. But as she stood in the kitchen, the flicker of something familiar caught her attention. A pattern she had seen before, but never quite connected. The window. It had been open, of course, but more importantly, the latch had been disturbed. Not broken, not forced open, but simply undone. The kind of action that someone might take if they were trying to avoid making a noise. A subtle touch, a careful movement. And then there was the knife, a single kitchen knife, freshly used, but not one that had been kept in plain sight. It had been pulled from the drawer, used with precision, and then returned as though nothing had happened. It was a detail that didn't sit right. Why the kitchen? Why the careful placement of the weapon back into the drawer? It was as though the killer had been trying to leave behind no trace, but in doing so had only revealed their presence even more. But there was more to it than just the physical evidence. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the earlier conversation with Mrs. Baines. The housekeeper had been the first to mention Mr. Ainsley's name, but something about the way she had said it, an edge in her voice, a hesitation, had raised a flag in Miss Marple's mind. Mrs. Baines had been the one to overhear Ainsley's conversation, and yet she hadn't immediately gone to the police with that information. Why had she waited? And more importantly, why had she not told Miss Marple everything? Her thoughts then turned to the ledger, the stolen piece of evidence. The pawnshop receipt had been the clue that had driven Miss Marple's suspicions about Mr. Ainsley, but there was still a piece missing, a detail that didn't quite align with everything she knew. Why would someone like Mr. Ainsley, a man who prided himself on control, risk leaving a clue so easily traceable? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that the pattern was not just about the murder. It was about the way the events had unfolded in the first place. The key was never in the obvious places. Lord Crayford's death was tragic, yes, but it had been designed to look like the culmination of a chaotic series of events. The ledger had been stolen to silence someone who knew too much, but it was more than just the theft that mattered. It was the timing of it all. Whoever had orchestrated these deaths had been waiting for the right moment, using each murder, each stolen piece of evidence to create a smokescreen, a distraction. And that was when it clicked. Miss Marple had been watching all the wrong things. The murders, the thefts, the lies, they were all distractions, clever misdirections meant to keep her focused on the obvious clues. But the true key to the case had been hidden in plain sight all along. She thought back to the simplest of details, the way the guests and staff had moved through the house, their habits, their conversations. The small, seemingly insignificant moments that often passed unnoticed. Ainsley, the lawyer, was the thread that had been there from the start. He had been too composed during the investigation, too controlled. Mrs. Baines's hesitation, her nervousness, had been the first crack in the carefully constructed facade. And now the open window, the subtle evidence of a staged scene in the kitchen. It was all part of the same pattern. The real crime wasn't the murder. It was the way the murderer had manipulated everyone around them, pushing people into positions where they would act without thinking, all while hiding their true identity behind a veil of decoys. Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she moved through the house, following the winding paths of the suspects in her mind. There was one person who had been too quiet, too observant, and too focused on the way the investigation was unfolding. And it wasn't Mr. Ainsley, as she had initially thought. It was Mrs. Baines. The housekeeper had been close to Lord Crayford, yes, but she had also been one of the few people who had access to the family's private affairs. She had been the one to find the ledger in the first place, and she had been the one to keep it hidden when others had come snooping around. The ledger's disappearance, combined with the theft of the knife and the carefully staged murder scene, all pointed to a plan that had been set into motion long before Miss Marple had arrived at the manor. But Mrs. Baines had been a piece in a larger game, and as Miss Marple looked over the evidence once more, she saw it. The pattern was clear now, the connections between the suspects, the movements, and the strange coincidences. Mrs. Baines had orchestrated it all, not out of greed or malice, but out of necessity. She had been forced into a corner, made to play. Her part in a deadly game where her own survival had been at stake. The key had always been in front of her, Miss Marple realized. It wasn't about finding the right person to blame. It was about understanding the motives that had driven them. And with the final piece falling into place, she knew what she had to do next. The clock was ticking. Mrs. Baines might have thought she had outsmarted Miss Marple, but now the detective was ready to confront the truth and to ensure that the final act would not unfold as the housekeeper had planned. Miss Marple stood alone in the dimly lit drawing room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows against the walls. She had pieced together the final threads of the mystery, and yet as she thought back on the events that had unfolded, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something that hadn't been immediately obvious, a deeper motive lurking beneath the surface. She had thought at first that the story was one of greed, of desperation, a common thread in many of her past cases. But as the pieces clicked into place, as the pattern began to emerge, Miss Marple had realized that the true driving force behind these crimes was not material wealth, nor revenge. It was something much darker, more insidious. Mrs. Baines, she now understood, was not just a victim of circumstance. She had orchestrated the entire series of events, not because of any financial or personal gain, but because of a twisted sense of need. In the end, the motive had been buried deep within the housekeeper's psyche, a psychological desperation that went beyond the surface-level actions that everyone had been focused on. Miss Marple's mind returned to the subtle clues, the fleeting moments that had seemed out of place, the odd behavior of Mrs. Baines when she had first approached the investigation, her nervous glances, the way she avoided direct eye contact, the way she had seemed too eager to be helpful, almost as if she were trying to mask something deeper. But Miss Marple had dismissed these signs at first, thinking them to be simple anxiety or guilt. Now she understood. It was fear, not guilt, that had driven Mrs. Baines to such extremes. Fear of something so deeply rooted in her past that it had pushed her to do the unthinkable. The housekeeper's devotion to Lord Crayford had always seemed a bit too fervent, too personal. But in the quiet moments when Miss Marple had listened to her, there had been hints, small, easily overlooked details that suggested something more. Mrs. Baines had been trying to protect someone whose very existence had been hidden from the rest of the world. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous lies were often the ones told to protect those we love. As she pieced together the full extent of the housekeeper's secret, a chilling truth emerged. Mrs. Baines had been guarding a hidden family member, someone long believed to be dead, but in reality, living in the shadows. a child of Lord Crayford's, born out of an illicit affair years before, a child who had been kept hidden away in the very manor that had now become the scene of so much bloodshed. It had been Mrs. Baines's desperate love for this child that had driven her to commit murder. She had done everything she could to protect the secret, even if it meant destroying anyone who might expose it. The ledger, the stolen documents, the carefully staged murder scenes, they were all part of her plan to keep the truth buried. The child, it seemed, had been Lord Crayford's greatest shame, a living reminder of a mistake he had long tried to forget. But Mrs. Baines had loved that child fiercely, and when the truth had begun to surface, when the threat of exposure had loomed too large, she had resorted to the only means she knew to protect her. Miss Marple's heart sank as the full weight of the housekeeper's twisted logic became clear. Mrs. Baines hadn't been motivated by money or power, nor even by revenge. She had been motivated by a need to protect a broken, hidden family, by a mother's desperate desire to shield her child from a world that would never accept them. The first murder had been the most calculated, a means of silencing anyone who had stumbled too close to the truth. Geoffrey's death had been a tragic miscalculation, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. But Lord Crayford's death had been a more deliberate act. It was the final piece in a carefully constructed plan, one that would ensure the secret remained buried. Miss Marple paused, the cold weight of this revelation settling over her. She had known, deep down, that there was something more to this case than what met the eye. Now she understood. The motive was not born of malice or selfish ambition. It was driven by a perverse form of love, a twisted devotion that had pushed a woman to murder in order to protect the one thing she held most dear. Her mind raced, calculating the next steps. Mrs. Baines was clever, far more so than Miss Marple had originally given her credit for. She had manipulated the situation, turning suspicion away from herself, using her knowledge of the household to cast doubt on everyone else. But in the end, her need to protect the child had been her undoing. Miss Marple had seen this kind of blind devotion before, the kind that could make someone do unthinkable things to preserve a secret. But this was different. Mrs. Baines had been willing to sacrifice everything, including her own life, to ensure that her child would never have to face the world alone. It was a kind of loyalty that transcended all reason. As the detective sat in silence, the quiet crackle of the fire the only sound in the room, she felt the weight of the investigation begin to shift. The game was no longer about solving a simple murder. It was about understanding the twisted psyche of a woman who had lost herself in her own delusions, a woman who had become so consumed by her need to protect her family that she had destroyed the very thing she had sought to safeguard, and now it was up to Miss Marple to bring that twisted truth to light, to expose the hidden motive that had driven these murders, and to ensure that the cycle of violence would end before it could claim anyone else. The night was far from over, and Miss Marple knew that she had only just uncovered the surface of a much darker truth. The investigation had taken its final turn, and with it came the understanding that some crimes were born not from hatred, but from a kind of tragic love that could consume everything in its path. Miss Marple rose, her resolve hardening. The final confrontation was at hand, and she was ready. The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of the drawing-room, casting long shadows across the floor. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the quiet garden outside, her mind turning over the details of the case one final time. The pieces had all come together now. the puzzle nearly complete. Mrs. Baines had been the architect of this entire tragedy, driven not by greed or ambition, but by a twisted, protective love. She had murdered to keep her secret, her child hidden, her family preserved. Miss Marple could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest, but she knew that this final confrontation had to be handled with care. She had no doubt that Mrs. Baines would be dangerous now, cornered and desperate. The woman had already killed once, perhaps twice, to safeguard her secret. There was no telling what she might do if faced with the inevitability of exposure. The detective's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. The door creaked open, and Constable Harper entered, his face tight with the tension of the past few days. His eyes flickered toward Miss Marple, then to the table where the various pieces of evidence had been laid out in neat, deliberate rows. It was clear that he had no idea what to make of the case anymore. The authorities had been close, but their focus had been too narrow. They hadn't seen the truth that Miss Marple had uncovered, but now they were ready to confront the woman who had orchestrated everything. "The housekeeper?" Harper asked, his voice uncertain. "You're sure it's her?" Miss Marple turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "Yes, Constable, she's the one. But I need you to follow my lead, and I need you to stay out of sight. We can't let her slip away now." Harper nodded, though there was a trace of doubt in his eyes. It wasn't that he didn't trust Miss Marple. He had come to respect her instincts over the course of the investigation, but the weight of what they were about to do still hung heavy. Confronting someone as calculating as Mrs. Baines was dangerous. There would be no turning back after this. As they moved through the manor toward the back rooms, Miss Marple's mind raced. The trap was set. She had made sure of it. Mrs. Baines had already made a critical mistake when she tried to retrieve the hidden letters from the safe in the study. Miss Marple had seen her slip inside under the cover of night, and though the woman had likely thought her actions were unnoticed, the detective had been observing closely. She had planted the final key piece of evidence, an envelope marked with a false lead, directly in her path. It had been a calculated risk, but Miss Marple trusted that Mrs. Baines would fall for it. The quiet shuffle of Mrs. Baines's footsteps reached Miss Marple's ears just before the door to the study opened. The housekeeper stepped into the room, her eyes darting warily over the space, as though she could sense the weight of the trap closing in. She straightened quickly, her face setting into an expression of defiance as she saw the two figures waiting for her. "I thought you might be here, Miss Marple," Mrs. Baines said, her voice strained but controlled. "You've been too clever for your own good, I fear." Miss Marple took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't believe you've quite understood the full extent of your situation, Mrs. Baines. You've made a grave mistake." The housekeeper's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "What mistake exactly?" "I've done nothing but protect my family." "You, Miss Marple, have taken it upon yourself to destroy everything I've worked for." "Worked for?" Miss Marple's voice was steady, though there was a hint of sadness in her tone. "You've murdered to protect a secret, but in the end all that will come of this is more pain, more destruction." Mrs. Baines's expression hardened, and for a brief moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Fear not for herself, but for the child she had so desperately tried to protect. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the woman's steely resolve. "I did what was necessary. You have no idea what it's like to watch your own flesh and blood be erased from the world." My child, my sweet, innocent child, you would never understand what I've sacrificed." "Sacrificed?" Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't sacrifice anything, Mrs. Baines. You killed to protect a lie. And now you will have to face the consequences." The housekeeper's gaze faltered for the briefest moment, as if she was weighing her options, perhaps realizing that the end was near. But then her shoulders stiffened, and she made her move. Before Miss Marple could react, Mrs. Baines had lunged toward the window, one hand reaching for a small, hidden revolver tucked into the folds of her dress. But Miss Marple was faster. Her mind had already anticipated the move, and before the housekeeper could raise the weapon, the detective had calmly placed a hand on her arm, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," Miss Marple said softly, her voice still calm but edged, with an authority that could not be denied. "There's no need for any more bloodshed." For a moment Mrs. Baines froze, her eyes locked on Miss Marple's. The weapon lowered slowly, and the tension in the room seemed to stretch to its breaking point. Finally, with a resigned sigh, the housekeeper let the revolver drop to the floor. "I suppose it's over then," she whispered, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the truth sank in. "I couldn't let them know. I couldn't let him, Lord Crayford, find out. He never knew about the child. I couldn't let him destroy her too." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "It's never too late to tell the truth, Mrs. Baines. The lies you've told may have kept you safe for a while, but they've only hurt you in the end." The housekeeper nodded, her face drained of colour. She seemed to collapse under the weight of her guilt, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Miss Marple stood by, her composure unwavering as she allowed the woman her moment of reckoning. And then, as the first rays of evening light filtered through the curtains, the housekeeper's fate was sealed. The law would take its course. But the truth, as Miss Marple knew, was the only thing that could truly bring an end to the madness that had consumed them all. The pieces of the puzzle had been set in motion, and at last the trap had been sprung. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, thick and oppressive, as Mrs. Baines's confession hung in the air. Miss Marple stood motionless, her fingers still lightly resting on the revolver that now lay forgotten on the floor. Constable Harper, who had remained hidden just beyond the door, took a step forward, his face grim but relieved. For a moment, it seemed as though everything was finally falling into place. The mystery, the lies, the dead ends, they were all tied up, ready for the authorities to take over. But just as the satisfaction of a job well done began to settle in, a new, unexpected voice broke the stillness. "Are we really done here, Miss Marple?" The voice was smooth, calculated, tinged with an unsettling calmness. It came from the doorway, where Lord Crayford stood framed in the entrance. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with something that Miss Marple could not quite place. The detective's stomach tightened, a cold shiver running down her spine. The room, which had moments ago felt so tightly controlled, suddenly seemed vast and unfamiliar again. Mrs. Baines, still kneeling on the floor, looked up at Lord Crayford with a mixture of shock and panic. It was as if the confession she had just offered meant nothing in the face of his arrival. "Lord Crayford," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the flicker of alarm. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure," Crayford replied, his tone smooth, though there was an undercurrent of something darker beneath it. "But I think you should have. After all, it's my house, isn't it?" Harper stepped forward cautiously, his hand hovering near the holster of his service revolver. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. There was something about Crayford's presence that didn't sit right. The man had always been aloof, distant, a figure of wealth and power. But now, with everything about to be exposed, his calm demeanor felt out of place. "Isn't it a bit too late to show up?" Harper asked, his voice strained. Crayford ignored him, his eyes locked on Miss Marple. "You've been very thorough, Miss Marple. I'll give you that. But there are things in motion that I'm not sure you've fully considered. You see, the truth is rarely as simple as it appears." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She had anticipated many twists and turns during the investigation, but this was not something she had expected. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the atmosphere, as if the ground was being pulled out from under her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low but sharp. Crayford took a step closer, and for a moment he seemed to revel in the mystery of the moment, enjoying the discomfort he had caused. He was playing the part of the enigmatic aristocrat too well. "It's simple, really, Mrs. Baines," he said, turning his gaze to the woman who was now trembling at his feet. "Wasn't the only one with a secret. No, Miss Marple, there was someone else, someone far closer to the heart of this house." A sickening realization settled over Miss Marple, but before she could voice it, Crayford continued. "You see, while Mrs. Baines tried to protect her child, I was protecting something else, my own interests." He paused, watching Miss Marple's eyes narrow. "But it's not just about protecting a legacy, it's about ensuring that the past doesn't return to haunt us." Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she slowly pieced the fragments together. The lingering questions she'd held in her mind about Lord Crayford's strange behaviour, his involvement in his wife's death, the inconsistencies in his alibi, all of it was starting to form a clearer picture. But there was more, something darker, more insidious than she had initially imagined. "You're not making sense," she said, though the cold certainty in her voice betrayed her growing understanding. Crayford smirked, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw something more than the aristocratic mask he wore. There was a glimmer of malice, of hidden knowledge that he had kept buried for far too long. "I'm sure it seems confusing, but the truth is simple. You were right all along. Miss Marple, I did orchestrate the death of my wife, not because I hated her, but because she was a threat to everything I'd worked for." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The child Mrs. Baines tried so hard to protect, she wasn't hers at all. She was mine." The room seemed to close in around Miss Marple. Her chest tightened as the full implications of his words settled over her. He had killed his wife, but not for inheritance, not for a title, not for revenge. He had killed her because she had known the truth. And that truth was about the child. A child he had fathered with another woman, hidden away for years, a dangerous secret that had the potential to ruin him. "Your wife knew, didn't she?" Miss Marple whispered. "She knew about the child." Crayford's eyes darkened. She had to die. It wasn't just about keeping the child a secret anymore. It was about control. The child could not inherit what I had worked for. She would have threatened everything. Miss Marple's mind raced. This was not just a case of murder. It was a carefully orchestrated plan involving deception, manipulation, and a cold-blooded need to protect his wealth and power. But it wasn't just about money. It was about the past coming back to haunt him, a past that had finally caught up with him thanks to the investigation. He had known this day was coming, but now, with the revelation out in the open, there was no turning back. The housekeeper, the murdered wife, the hidden child, they were all pawns in Lord Crayford's game. And he had just revealed himself as the true mastermind. Miss Marple knew, with chilling clarity, that the case was far from over. But it wasn't just about solving the crime anymore. It was about ensuring that Crayford didn't get away with it. "Lord Crayford," she said softly, the words weighed down by finality, "you've made a grave mistake." A smile flickered across his lips as he glanced at Mrs. Baines, still on the floor, defeated. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but let's see if you can prove it." The tension in the room seemed unbearable as Crayford's smirk faded, replaced by a faint flicker of uncertainty. Miss Marple had cornered him, and now the pieces of the puzzle, which he had so carefully hidden, were finally laid bare. Yet even with the truth exposed, there was still a question lingering in the air. What would happen now? "I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of finality. "You may think you've orchestrated everything perfectly, but you've made one fatal mistake." Lord Crayford's gaze sharpened. His usual composure cracked, just slightly, enough to show the depth of his fear. "And what might that be, Miss Marple? Do you think you can simply walk in here and solve this when I've been playing this game for years?" "Not years, Lord Crayford," Miss Marple replied, her eyes glinting with the calm assurance that only came from seeing through the lies. "It's the smallest things that unravel the grandest plans. And it's not the grand gestures or the bold decisions that trip you up. It's the details, the ones people overlook, like an offhand comment, an unexpected movement, or the way a person reacts to something they shouldn't." Her voice was calm, unshaken, even as Crayford's grip tightened on the edge of the table before him. Mrs. Baines remained seated on the floor, her hands shaking, her eyes flickering between the two figures locked in verbal battle. She was still trying to process what had just been revealed. Her loyalty had been betrayed in ways she couldn't even comprehend. "You missed a crucial moment," Miss Marple continued, now speaking directly to Crayford. "The moment when you let your guard down, when you thought you were safe, but the truth slipped through. The child you thought was gone, the one you were so desperate to protect, she was never far from you." Crayford sneered. "You're delusional. You're twisting words now." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "You didn't count on one thing, the timing of your wife's death. You believed that if she was removed, the child's secret would remain hidden. But you never accounted for her last act of defiance, the letter she left behind." Crayford's eyes widened, and in that split second, Miss Marple could see it, his mind scrambling to process the very thing he had believed would remain buried forever. The letter, the one that had been stashed in the back of a drawer, forgotten by everyone except for her, and now a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded in Crayford's life. A letter that confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along, the identity of the child's real mother and the plans to expose Crayford for what he had done. "You think you've been clever," Miss Marple continued, stepping closer, "the final pieces now falling into place. But your wife was more clever than you gave her credit for. She knew what you had done, and she knew that if anything happened to her, that letter would be the one thing that could bring you down. And that's why she was murdered." Crayford's expression faltered just for a moment. It was enough. "No," he whispered, almost to himself, as if he had been trying to convince himself this entire time. She She wouldn't. But Miss Marple didn't relent. She would, and she did. She left it hidden, knowing that when the time came, someone would find it. Someone like me. The silence in the room felt like an eternity, and yet the moment stretched only a few seconds longer. Crayford's mind was still reeling, but it was too late now. He had underestimated her, underestimated the power of a single overlooked detail. Harper, who had been standing silently at the door, made a small, cautious move forward. His hand hovered near his revolver, ready for any sign of escape or violence from Crayford. Miss Marple noticed his tension, but she remained resolute. There was no more need for hesitation. The truth had already come to light. "I've taken the liberty of making sure the letter is safely in the hands of the authorities," Miss Marple added. "It's all there. The proof of your involvement, the twisted web of lies you've spun over the years. The hidden child, the murder of your wife, the manipulation of everyone around you. It's all documented, and it will bring you down, one way or another." For the first time, Lord Crayford looked fully defeated. His shoulders slumped, and the mask he had worn for so long seemed to crack, revealing the man beneath, the one who had clung so desperately to his power and secrets. "I thought I could control everything," he murmured almost to himself. "I thought I could keep it hidden forever." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but only briefly. She knew that this man was beyond redemption, that there was no true justice for him. The weight of his crimes would follow him no matter how he tried to escape it. "I'm afraid," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction, "there's no escaping the truth now." As the authorities arrived to take Lord Crayford into custody, Miss Marple stood aside, allowing them to do their duty. The wheels of justice had turned, but there was still an unsettling sense of incompleteness hanging in the air. The investigation had come to its end, but there would be no sense of satisfaction in its resolution. There would be no celebration of the truth uncovered. For Miss Marple, there was only the quiet satisfaction of having solved the mystery, of having pieced together the fragments of a story that others had overlooked. But as the last of the police officers left the room and the door clicked shut, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was a little darker for having known the truth about Lord Crayford. Mrs. Baines stood up shakily, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple looked at her, offering a small, understanding smile. "Now we move on. We put the past to rest. But know this: justice has been served, even if it's not always as neat as we hope." And with that, the last chapter of the affair of the missing butler closed. The mystery was solved. But for Miss Marple, the shadows of the case would linger long after the truth had been revealed. Miss Marple stepped into the crisp evening air, her mind already sorting through the events of the past days. The case of Lord Crayford, with its intricate web of deception and betrayal, had been solved. Yet as she walked toward the small bench under the old oak tree near the manor, she couldn't help but feel a slight unease, a nagging sense that something remained unresolved. She sat down, the cool wood of the bench pressing against her back, her thoughts whirring, as though she were piecing together fragments of an unfinished puzzle. Even in the quiet of the garden, with the manor behind her and the distant chatter of the constables completing their final rounds, something still whispered to her from the depths of the case. "Mrs. Baines," she muttered softly to herself, remembering the woman's tear-streaked face, as she had taken her place among the witnesses. There was an odd tension in her movements, an almost practiced innocence that seemed to veer dangerously close to a calculated act. It was an odd thing to notice in the midst of the revelations. Miss Marple had questioned everyone in that house, each suspect, each witness. But something about Mrs. Baines's reactions had stayed with her. She turned her thoughts over, like stones in her hand, searching for a crack, a break in the surface. It wasn't the woman's obvious grief over the loss of her friend that had struck Miss Marple as strange. It was the way she had failed to look Miss Marple directly in the eye during certain moments, her hands always fidgeting with the hem of her skirt, and the way she had reacted when the letter, hidden by Lord Crayford's wife, had been mentioned. Of course, Mrs. Baines had been in shock like everyone else, but there was more to it than that. Could it be possible that the truth had been far murkier than what even Miss Marple had uncovered? Was it conceivable that the real culprit had been lying right in front of her, hidden under the cloak of sorrow and sympathy? Her eyes narrowed as she considered the possibility. No, she couldn't ignore what she had seen, not now. The missing butler had been a minor player in the larger game, but Mrs. Baines, her presence in the house, had been far more critical than anyone had initially realized. She was one of the few who had been there for everything, a silent witness who had drifted between rooms unnoticed, seen, but never questioned. And then there was the small matter of the strange behavior surrounding the garden, where the real confrontation had taken place, behind the locked door. Lord Crayford had mentioned the garden in passing, but his face had revealed a flicker of recognition when it was brought up. It was the same place where Mrs. Baines had been found, hands trembling near the flower beds. There was something unnerving about her proximity to that exact spot. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself. The more she thought about it, the clearer the connection seemed to be. There were layers of deception, layers that would have remained hidden if it weren't for that one fleeting moment. The look in Mrs. Baines's eyes. The piece she had missed. A small but telling glance when Lord Crayford had been backed into a corner. More to the story, my dear, Miss Marple whispered aloud. She could almost hear the words echoing in the back of her mind. There was a puzzle here, after all, one that hadn't been solved, not completely. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, where the faintest hint of dawn began to brush the sky with light. The night had passed, but her work was far from over. The mystery of the missing butler had reached its conclusion, yes, but there was something else now. The shadow of a new question lingered in the silence, and Miss Marple could sense it in the air, the way the wind rustled the leaves, as if nature itself was whispering the next chapter. She stood slowly, the light of day beginning to fill the garden with golden hues. The case had been closed. Crayford had been apprehended. Justice had been served. But even so, Miss Marple knew better than anyone that a mystery never truly ended. As she walked away from the bench, her thoughts turned inward, reviewing every detail once more. It wasn't the first time she had been faced with a puzzle that had yet to reveal its full complexity, nor would it be the last. There were mysteries in every corner of life, secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience to uncover them. Her footsteps were steady, her mind resolute. It was just a matter of time before the next case would find its way to her. And when it did, she would be ready. In the distance, the faint echo of a horse's hooves broke through the quiet morning air. The carriage would soon arrive, the world would continue, and Miss Marple, quiet, unassuming, would once again slip into the background of life, observing, listening, waiting for the next ripple in the pond of human nature.